Welcome to this topic revision video for inflation and the conflicts between objectives, which is the fifth topic in the A-level macroeconomics course. Inflation is a rise in the general level of prices in an economy, the price level being the kind of average price of goods and services. Deflation is a fall in that price level, while disinflation is a fall in the rate of inflation. So the price level is still rising, but at a slower rate. Now, all of these are measured using changes in a price index, which is a weighted average of the prices of goods and services in an economy. It's constructed using a basket of representative goods from the average UK family, which is data that's gathered using a survey, the Living Costs and Food Survey. A weighted average of prices is taken, and the weights, the significance of those prices, is based on how much the average family buys of those goods and services. And a resulting index is used to measure changes in the price level. We do need to know roughly how this is calculated. Based on the data here, the first thing we do is convert all of our prices into indices. In this case, year one is our base year, so there are 100, and year two is the year we're interested in. We're then going to times those indices by the weights in each case. We're going to add those up and divide them by the sum of the weights in order to get our weighted index for year two, which in this case is 110. Now, more generally, our price indices, there's two big ones we need to know. CPI is the consumer price index and RPI is the retail price index. And some nice context in the exam would be looking at the difference between the two. A high rate of inflation is not ideal in an economy. High inflation is correlated with high uncertainty. Most inflation is quite unpredictable, so high inflation it creates lots of uncertainty and has very negative impacts, therefore, on it, particularly investment, but also consumption. Inflation that's more predictable is a bit less concerning, but that's not hugely common. Inflation redistributes wealth and income around an economy. Savers lose out when there's high inflation because the real value of their savings is diminished, while those with high level of borrowing gain because the real value of their debt decreases. A couple of microeconomic impacts. Menu costs is the cost of firms having to frequently update their prices and practically having to change things, but also having to do the market research behind working out the appropriate price. And changing prices makes it much harder for consumers to understand the market, working out what is the most competitive price. They have to spend a lot more energy researching prices. That might result in less competition. And that's known as shoe leather costs because it refers to the fact that once consumers would have actually had to use up the leather in their shoes walking between different firms. Fiscal drag is the process of the real tax burden increasing with inflation because income taxes do not always adjust in line with inflation. So as there's more inflation, nominal wages might go up, but real wages actually stay the same. But because income tax bands don't go up in line with inflation, the percentage of income being paid as tax increases. And if there's no real increase in wages, no increase in real wages, then that means there's a higher percentage tax. We do also need to know some impacts of deflation. Deflation, a fall in the price level, reduces consumer spending because if you know prices are going to fall, you'll probably wait to spend your money. That in turn reduces aggregate demand, leading to further deflation. So deflation is really problematic, but the extent to which it's problematic depends on the cause. Benign deflation is caused by increased short-run or long-run aggregate supply. Lower costs of production lead to lower prices, and that's a good thing. But malign deflation is caused by decreased aggregate demand. A fall in demand, a negative output gap, or recession means there's deflation, and that in turn can lead to further deflation. The Bank of England's target for inflation is 2%, and that's because although we don't like high inflation, we also don't like deflation. And a tiny bit of inflation is quite beneficial because a little bit of inflation can help markets adjust. If the nominal wage, for example, stays the same, then the real wage is slowly falling. So it just gives market adjustments a little bit more breathing room. There are two main causes of inflation. Demand pull inflation is caused by an increase in aggregate demand. More production, there's more demand for goods and services, means more is being produced, and that puts upwards pressure on the economy's scarce resources, causing costs to rise. And this is going to be particularly problematic if there's a positive output gap. If the economy is close to or beyond its productive possibility frontier, its productive capacity, we're going to get even more inflation. Cost push inflation is caused by a fall in aggregate supply, perhaps because of an increase in commodity prices or something similar. That means there's less being produced, which means goods and services are more scarce, pushing prices up. And obviously this type of inflation has the downside of also resulting in lower output. An older perspective on inflation revolves around this identity. All economists agree that this is factually true. The money supply times by the velocity of money will always in an economy equal the price times the output. That stands to reason because the price level times the output in the economy is just the amount of money that's spent, prices times the amount produced. But so too is MV, the money supply times velocity. The total amount of money times the velocity of money, which is how many times it's gone around the economy, must equal the total amount that's spent. Now, if we assume that the velocity of money and the quantity produced in an economy are constant over time, then the only determinant of P, the price level, is M, the money supply. In the long run, or the very long run, this might be fairly true, and this is the oldest theory of inflation. But of course, velocity and quantity do change. A rise in the velocity or a fall in the velocity might be linked, for example, to confidence in the economy. If consumers aren't confident, they'll hold on to their money. Whereas output depends as well on supply side variables. The trickiest part of this topic is when we link inflation to our other objectives and consider the conflict with other objectives. And there's lots to say here, but the main thing we want to talk about is the conflict between inflation and unemployment, which is captured by the Phillips curve. High levels of unemployment lead to low levels of inflation and vice versa. The reason for that is that when there's high levels of unemployment, there's low demand in the economy, so not much pressure on prices. In the short run, there's this trade-off. Less unemployment means more inflation. And governments might manipulate that. They might make the most of that to reduce unemployment. The logic being, if we use demand-side policies to reduce unemployment, we just get some inflation. That's fine. But in the long run, this can be problematic. If we're reducing unemployment in this way, over time, the higher inflation increases my expectations of wages. As a result, employees bargain up wages are pushed up. So we end up with unemployment returning to where it was as wages rise, and inflation staying higher because those higher wages are passed on in the form of higher costs and higher prices. Unemployment therefore returns to that normal level, but inflation stays high. And so in the long run, we cannot do better than UN on the diagram, the natural rate of unemployment, which we met in the unemployment topic. We're stuck at our long-run Phillips curve, or our EAPC, our expectations augmented Phillips curve. Now, this logic that's on the screen in the diagram, we've actually met before in ADAS. A is our equilibrium. Now, suppose the government decides to use expansionary fiscal policy to improve accurate demand. We'd get a positive output gap. That's equivalent to B on both diagrams. There will be reduced unemployment, but there's going to be inflation. But in the long run, this inflation puts upwards pressure on wages, and we end up back where we were at C. The key mechanism is that in both cases, it's the same idea. Wages are rising, and it's that returns us to where we were, our full employment level, our natural rate of unemployment, and leads to higher inflation. We can, of course, therefore avoid conflict if, rather than using short-run demand-side policies, we use long-run supply-side policies. Policies that increase long-run aggregate supply, increase long-run growth, or reduce the natural rate of unemployment. And for both of those, see previous videos. There are other conflicts worth mentioning that we need to be aware of, things like the conflict between inflation and short-run growth. That's just our Phillips curve, really, isn't it? If we increase growth using demand-side policies, short-run growth will get inflation. Things like growth versus inequality. As we get high growth, we tend to get higher inequality. Or perhaps growth now versus future growth. Economies might be able to grow now quite quickly at the expense of growth in the future. And that might be because of environmental considerations. But this conflict between inflation and unemployment, or inflation and growth, is our main conflict that we'd want to talk about if we were discussing conflicts in an exam.